We should begin this afternoon's session, please. Thank you. My first task this afternoon is a very pleasurable one of presenting the honorary membership of the NBN to one of the titans of our recording world, John Newbold. I'll say a few words about John. He qualified as a pharmacist in 1966 and practiced pharmacy for much of his career. But that's a completely different story, because John is also an ardent field naturalist and not only likes to record, but also likes to shake things up. The key dates from our point of view is 1978, when John joined the Yorkshire Naturalists Union, becoming the treasurer in 1995 and general secretary in 2004. During the same period, he's been treasurer, membership secretary, and secretary on the Council of the National Federation of Biological Recording. Without the contributions that John has made over many years, both the YNU and the NFBR would not have flourished as they have. He's a prime example of the lifeblood of the NBN. He's an amateur naturalist who is committed to studying natural history and to sharing his results and promoting enthusiasm in others. I'll now ask John to come up and collect a certificate and a small goodie in this box. I now have another great pleasure, which is to introduce my good friend, Sir John Lawton, as this year's Sir John Burnett Memorial Lecturer. And it's very nice that Andrew Burnett, Sir John's son, is also here this afternoon. John is one of the world's foremost ecologists, having published literally hundreds of important ecological research papers on population dynamics and the ecological science underpinning key questions in biodiversity, which he did while a professor at York and then at Imperial College. This led to his election to the Royal Society in 1989, and more recently as a foreign associate of the US National Academy of Science, which is a rare honor. It has also led to a cupboard full of prizes, including President's Gold Medal of the British Ecological Society, the Japan Prize, the RSPB medal, and the list goes on. From Imperial College, John became Chief Executive of the Natural Environment Research Council and was then appointed Chairman of the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution in 2005. Over the last decade, his emphasis has been mainly on the impacts of global environmental change on wild animals and plants. And as Chairman of the RSPB, he was instrumental in establishing their strategy for protecting landscapes. And now, most recently, in 2010, he chaired a review group that has really shaken things up with the so-called Lawton Report, otherwise known as Making Space for Nature, a review of England's wildlife sites and ecological networks. And that conveniently leads me to the title of his talk this afternoon, Making Space for Nature, the Importance of Biological Recording. John.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that. You get two Yorkshiremen this afternoon. Actually, I'm an adopted Yorkshireman. I'm going to talk to you about making space for nature, as Mike said, and the role that biological recording played in that report. This is my local patch. There's York in the middle. It's the recording area for the York Ornithological Club, and I regard it as my local patch, and that's where I do my BTO garden birdwatch, including butterflies and other insects, the breeding bird survey, where I have a regular British breeding bird survey, Pocklington Canal, where I've systematically watched the spread of dragonflies into Yorkshire once they realised it didn't rain there all the time. And BTO Wintering Plover Survey, the Lower Derwent Valley National Nature Reserve, the BTO Bird Atlas, and so on. It's my local patch. There's my breeding bird survey square, SE 6750. Pretty typical piece of the Vale of York, some quite attractive, some not less attractive, and an interesting variety of farmland birds. Now, I'm not showing you that because it's in any way special. It's because it's so ordinary, so many people do that, that makes it so very extraordinary in aggregate. And you know, you all talk to one another about biological recording, you think about it a lot. It's worthwhile just reminding yourself how absolutely extraordinary the voluntary effort actually is. There will be 60,000 people, I'm told, involved in collecting data that feeds into the National Biodiversity Network. This is the BTO breeding bird survey sites throughout the Great Britain. There are clearly rather thin on the ground up in the northwest of Scotland, but otherwise that's a truly remarkable network of recording sites. And so that although I thought Nick Isaac's talk this morning was absolutely fascinating, if the breeding bird survey square says something is declining, it's declining. And it isn't just birds, of course. If it's alive, we record it. Hoverflies, it's interesting which groups attract people and which don't. And for some reason, which I don't find easy to understand, people love hoverflies. They're sort of all right. But the number of records, the number of recorders and so on has been increasing quite dramatically over the years. And just to prepare for this talk, I went and did some homework and just figured out the scale of the operation of the National Biodiversity Gateway. And you're familiar with all those numbers, but it is, again, it's the sheer scale of the operation. Each one the result of an amateur or volunteer recorder, largely, putting information into the National Biodiversity Network. It is an astonishing achievement. No other nation on earth can do what we can do. And because of that largely volunteer effort, we know a huge amount about the British flora and fauna. As somebody once said to me, we have the best documented and most messed about flora and fauna in the world, except he didn't say messed about. He used the technical expression buggered up. So we can record the establishment of aliens. This is, again, BTO data. The yellow spots on the black spots are where black spawns have been recorded. The yellow spots are where they've been recorded breeding. Astonishing detailed information. We can look at the climate change impacts on the phenology, the timing of events for various taxa. So on the left there, you've got the BTO annual review of the change in the arrival dates of a whole series of summer migrants. Those that are arriving earlier to the left are doing okay as they synchronize their breeding with climate change. But those towards the right of the slide are faring very badly. A lot of those are long-distance trans-Saharan migrants that are arriving too late now to time their breeding with peak food supply. And we know that again in exquisite detail. The right shows some recent work by Chris Thomas and his colleagues at the University of York on the brown argus, the little butterfly at the top, whose range was formerly confined to where it fed on rock roses, the middle flower on there, on the red dots on the map. And then, with climate change allowing the brown argus to spread north, it actually switched host plants as well onto geranium, and the graph on the top right there simply shows the proportion of records of brown argus now feeding on geranium rather than on rock roses. So we know where the butterfly is, we know the rock rose is, we know the geranium is, in great detail, to be able to show a really quite dramatic change in range and abundance. We also have monitored through the data that volunteers have largely gathered on extinctions or local extinctions and recovery. The complete extinction of the large blue butterfly, followed by the reintroduction and the dramatic recovery of large blue butterflies. The recent reintroduction programs for red kites, increasingly a common bird that you see almost anywhere in lowland England now, and the restoration of the lady's slipper. So, you know, and sometimes the message is a good one. But we also know from the huge amount of data we now have that all is not well with the UK flora and fauna. And in 2009, knowing and caring about what was happening to the UK flora and fauna and the steady local extinction and the steady decline of many taxa, Hilary Benn, the then Secretary of State, asked me to chair a review of England's protected area network to see whether it was fit for purpose. And the thing that sparked Hilary's interest, because I had several conversations with him before I took on the job, was the detailed records we had for so much of our flora and fauna that we now take for granted, but actually was completely influential in getting Hilary to take the problems of the decline of many parts of our flora and fauna very seriously. So I'm going to talk about making space for nature, give you a brief history of the report and the main underlying conclusions, and the programme to create what ended up being called Nature Improvement Areas, or NIAs. The terms of reference really were to examine the evidence to the extent to which England's collection of wildlife sites, the protected area network, was a coherent and resilient ecological network, particularly to deliver effective conservation, not least in the presence of climate change. They were then somewhat elaborated, and we had to come up with some costings. This is a protected area network. You'll all be familiar with it. It has some core areas, major pieces of habitat that are protected. It has corridors, either newly formed corridors or existing corridors, small reserves that act as island stepping stones through which species can move, buffer zones around the areas, and restored and recreated habitats together constitute the protected area network, embedded in a matrix, the pale green background, which could be farmland, agricultural land, or it could be an urban area. And Making Space for Nature actually identified, for the very first time, nobody had ever done this, which is remarkable in 2009 if you think about it, the three kinds of sites that have some kind of protection. The Tier 1 sites, their primary purpose is nature conservation. They have a very high level of protection, either because they're owned by voluntary conservation bodies or they're statutorily protected. They're sites of special scientific interest, special areas of conservation, Ramsar sites, national nature reserves, and so on. They constitute about 6.9% of England's land and freshwater area. Tier 2 sites are designated for their high biodiversity value, but they don't have statutory protection by and large. They are largely protected by the planning system, and they include local wildlife sites and ancient woodland inventory. And Tier 3 sites are primarily designated for other purposes, but wildlife conservation is included as a secondary consideration in their statutory purpose. They're the areas of outstanding natural beauty that make up just over 14% of the land area, and national parks, which make up about 9% of the land area. The Convention on Biological Diversity at Nagoya in October 2010 aimed to say that about 17% of all terrestrial and freshwater habitats in the 100 and something signatory countries should be designated for nature conservation. Why 17%? Well, it was done by a committee, and it was a compromise between 15 and 20. There are a lot of other sites, by the way, but they don't have designation, and we're not going to talk about it. So the Tier 1 sites, this is where the Tier 1 sites are, and as somebody said this morning when they were actually, there's not a lot happens in the Midlands. And you can see why I live in Yorkshire, because Tier 1 sites, there's a lot of them up in the north of England. And anyway, they make up about 6.9% of the land area. Tier 2 sites make up 6.5%. Those are the green patches. And Tier 3 sites are the national parks and AMBs, which make up the other about 25%. Now, you look at that map and you think, well, actually, gosh, we must have, because of the Nagoya said 17%, we must be there by now. Well, actually, we're not, and you have to be very careful about double counting. You can't just add up those percentages. For example, just one example, just over 23% of the areas of national parks, about a quarter of the area of our national parks, are also sites of special scientific interest. So you can't just add up the percentages. And in fact, if you do the sums, and we still don't have an exact grip, we know that we haven't yet got to 17%. It's probably of the order of 13% of actually the land area and the freshwater area of England is protected formally, either by the planning system or legally. So we're not quite there yet with Nagoya. Incidentally, I am just talking about England and not the marine environment, because that's what Hilary Benn asked me to do, and we would need to do similar things in Wales, in Scotland, and probably for the marine environment. I don't think we could do that yet. And yet, despite all that effort, despite that protected area, the UK continues to lose wild plants and animals at a quite alarming rate. Some of them, as we heard this morning, are delightful artifacts of the data, but most of it's real. Making Space for Nature reviewed the evidence in detail. An excellent summary in Silent Summer, the book that summarised, edited by Norman MacLean, where you've got chapter after chapter after chapter of what's happening to Britain's flora and fauna. And that's despite the protected area network. So think how much worse it will be without the protected area network. But despite the protected area network, we are still on the voluntary recording that actually allows us to say with complete confidence things are getting worse. We win some of the battles, but we're steadily losing the war. And the report concluded, because of that, that the protected area network we have is not a coherent and resilient ecological network. Why not? Well, many of the sites are too small. The loss of some habitats has been enormous, that they're no longer really viable. With the exception of a small number of sites, Natura 2000 and SSSIs, most of the protected area network is undermanaged. And many of the natural corridors in our countryside have been degraded and lost, which makes it more difficult for species to move around. And finally, quite a different category, too few people have easy access to wildlife. Let's just look at some of those things. This is my favourite area in the whole world. It's the Lower Derwent Valley National Nature Reserve. The Yorkshire Wildlife Trust has a major reserve at the north end called Weldrake Ings. And Weldrake Ings and the valley itself, the Weldrake Ings is 2 kilometres across. We're looking at east there, it's 2 kilometres across. And the valley itself is 8 kilometres long. It's a big, seriously big area of hay meadows and wetlands in the winter. And size matters. Why does size matter? Well, as I think many of you will know, this is a classical species area relationship. It shows breeding birds in woodlands of different size in Britain. And big woods have more species in them than small woods. Big nature reserves hold more species than small nature reserves, and in a surprisingly regular way. That species area relationship applies to almost any group of organisms wherever you would look in the world. And it's a very regular one. It's the regularity that's surprising, not the fact that big areas have more species than small areas. So big reserves are important. Size also matters for another reason. This is the British heron population. What it's actually done, these are hard winters, and you can see that after a series of hard winters, the heron population declines. All populations fluctuate for all kinds of reasons. I've just picked the heron because it's a particularly nice example. If you reduce the amount of habitat available to herons by this amount, so you make the size of the patch in which herons live smaller, you notice that they would actually have gone extinct twice. If you make it even smaller again, you lose them a lot of times. In other words, small populations that fluctuate inevitably are vulnerable to extinction, and if the patch of habitat they're in is isolated, they're not able to recolonize, and you gradually lose species from the site. A lot of small nature reserves, almost certainly the populations that are on them have been called the living dead. They're going extinct, they just haven't gone extinct yet. And big reserves matter because they usually have a more varied topography. Varied topography allows species to find the microclimate that they need and the water conditions that they need more easily than a very simple topography. And incidentally, that's just above Grass Wood in Wharfdale. And the yellow on there isn't buttercups, it's rock rose. And the scale of the destruction of habitats is huge. We've lost 97% of species-rich meadows in England since the 1930s, and the losses continue. We had, it is thought, several thousand square kilometres of lowland bogs in England. We now have literally just 10 square kilometres left from thousands. Over 80% of lowland heath in England has been lost since 1800, most of it since 1950. But in heathland, interestingly, we've turned the corner. Habitat management and restoration is now replacing some of those lost habitats. And that habitat management is absolutely essential. If we don't manage many of our semi-natural habitats, because they are the creation of thousands, in some cases years, of human activity, we don't put the drains into the wetlands, if we don't graze the scrubland, if we don't replant woodlands and bring in classical woodland flora and so on and so forth, then we've got to manage the habitats we've got, and lack of habitat management is another major reason why we don't have an effective protected area network. And so is loss of connectivity, increasing isolation of the precious sites that we've got. Well-connected landscapes like this one here, which is in the Howardian Hills area of outstanding natural beauty to the north of York, allows species to move through natural corridors. But elsewhere in Yorkshire, in the East Riding, on the Wolds, boy, it's boring. They're seriously big fields, seriously the little patches of habitat, which are often the churchyards, for example. That's a churchyard up on the Yorkshire Wolds. Tiny pockets of surviving grassland in what is otherwise an arable prairie. And so connectivity has been completely lost. There's a wonderful little nature reserve behind King's Cross. Some of you might have been there. If you ever have an hour to spare and you're stuck at King's Cross Station, which I am regularly, I go to Camley Street Nature Park, literally half a kilometre from King's Cross, and it's a wonderful little oasis, but it's isolated and tiny. But it's a jolly nice place to be. It's better than sitting on King's Cross Station drinking beer. Well, almost. And species vary enormously in their ability to move through the landscape. So if you're a red admiral, you move very easily. Isolated habitat patches are not a problem for you. If you're a spettlewood butterfly, it's more tricky. It took spettlewoods quite a long time to cross the Vale of York as they moved north under climate change, because Vale of York has very little woodland. And some species, like Dog's Mercury, can hardly move at all. And if we're trying to do the impossible and recreate ancient woodland, which is an oxymoron, of course, you can't recreate ancient woodland, you can just recreate woodland, we're going to have to introduce those kind of species, and we are doing. And of course, too few people have easy access to wildlife. The more we degrade the countryside, the smaller the reserves become, and so on. Too few people have easy access to high quality green space, and as we heard this morning again, access to high quality green space is good for people. It's good for their mental and physical well-being, particularly good for children. And I said in the report that people shouldn't have to travel long distances to see something more interesting than a grey squirrel and a dandelion. I have a very close friend called John Richards, who was professor of botany at Newcastle University, and John is the taxonomic expert on dandelions. And he gave me a really hard time for writing that. So what should we do? Well, what the report said we should do, and you can summarise the conclusions of Making Space for Nature in just 4 words. We need more reserves, bigger reserves, better managed reserves, and joined up reserves. More, bigger, better, and joined is what we should do. That's the executive summary for busy ministers. They find it more difficult to read longer reports. Actually, they did read this, very much so. And the order in which we should do that is not actually more, bigger, better, and joined, but actually we need to improve the quality of current sites. First, if you're £1 to spend and an acre to manage or buy, first thing we should do is improve the management. We need to, second, increase the size of sites. We need to create new sites. We need to enhance the connections or join sites up. And we need to reduce the pressure on wildlife in the matrix. That's the sequence in which investment is recommended in Making Space for Nature. Corridors, just one of the things that Hilary Ben asked us to look at, come in many forms. Allowing species to move through the landscape and recolonise areas come in many forms. Natural ones, like natural river corridors, but things like old railway lines and the Regent's Canal in London and strips of farm tracks on the Vale of York are all potential corridors. And the farmer, with the one on the bottom right there, the farmer was going to remove all the hedge on the left-hand side because it was untidy. And I told him not to. Politely. One of the recommendations in Making Space for Nature was, in the face of the catalogue of problems that I've outlined, is that there should be ecological restoration zones, we call them in Making Space for Nature. Now, there were 24 recommendations in Making Space for Nature, all of which are necessary and important, but the third one was about ecological restoration zones. And we envisaged these as being not imposed by Natural England, not imposed from the top down, but consortia-led from the bottom up, and involving local authorities, local communities, landowners, utility companies, voluntary conservation sector, and national parks, other national agencies and so on. And in Making Space for Nature, we recommended that there should be a national competition to establish 12 ecological restoration zones. When I went to see the new Secretary of State, by the time the report came out, Hilary Benn, the government had been defeated, and Hilary Benn was no longer Secretary of State, but Caroline Spellman, to her eternal credit as the new Secretary of State, decided to accept the report and act on it. When I went to see Caroline and explained to her, she was very worried that ecological restoration zones, if you had a competition, there would be losers. And I thought, coming from a Conservative cabinet member, that was pretty rich. However, she was persuaded by the argument. And in the Natural Environment White Paper, they simply changed the name to Nature Improvement Areas. And we then did indeed have a competition for nature improvement areas. The competition was announced in the Natural Environment White Paper in June 2011. And I was worried at that point we wouldn't get any applications. We actually got 76 valid applications from all over the country for all kinds of consortia. It unleashed a tidal wave of consortia of the willing and creativity. The government is putting a mere, and they're now underway. We reduced the 76 to 12. It was very hard work doing that. There were some cracking applications that didn't make it. And the government put in about 7.5 million quid. Put in 7.5 million quid. It's small change from the back of the sofa. But it was valuable money because it was seed corn money. And each nature improvement area got about £625,000 on average. This is where they are. There are 12 of them. You can see where they're located. They're the yellow spots on the map. And they're widely different kinds of habitats. So, for example, there's one I think here. This is the South Downs Way, and there's a string of habitat restoration projects along that long-distance footpath. Wouldn't it be great to do that along all the long-distance footpaths of Britain? And then there are limestone and grasslands and wetlands in Morecambe Bay. There's an entirely urban one in Birmingham and the Black Country, the Humber Head levels, and so on. They're scattered around the country. And the modal size of each one is about 50,000 hectares. That's conservation you can see from the moon. Here's 3 of them, just to give you an example. This is the Marlborough Downs grassland. This is an entirely farmer-led consortium. Led by farmers, envisaged by farmers, created by farmers. These are the existing pockets of protected areas, and what they're proposing to do, amongst other things, is join them all up, recreating and restoring grasslands, as well as doing all kinds of other things. This is the Neem Valley, which is a very unusual NIA because it follows the courses of the River Nene and its tributaries, and the areas to be restored are all these degraded grasslands in red. And this is the Morecambe Bay NIA, which is virtually all of it going to be turned back into really effective, high-quality nature conservation. So they're very varied in scope and scale. And the really interesting thing is that by this October, in addition to the £7.5 million the government have put in, those 12 NIAs, across all the 12 NIAs, and they've all been successful, have managed to lever an extra £43 million for conservation on the NIAs, in kind and in cash. All kinds of additional ways of raising money, utility companies interested in restoring peatlands and uplands to improve water quality, the Environment Agency for flood control, visitor payback schemes, local authority investments, national park investments, and so on. Local authorities, a lot of the big urban local authorities really got it, and although this was a quote from a local authority that wasn't actually successful, the leader of one of the north of England's major conurbations, the leader of the city council, said that access to high quality green space and nature for our people is not an impediment to economic development. It is fundamental to economic development. So, we're winning the battle, it just takes a long time. And the exciting thing is we know how to do it. For many, albeit not all habitats, as I say, it's difficult to recreate ancient woodlands. And we have some real successes. This is not hypothetical. The restoration of the large blue butterfly, the reintroduction of white-tailed eagles, the creation of latent heath fen, which was a carrot fields when I was chairman of RSPB Council, and some of the members of council thought I was absolutely barky mad to go out and buy a carrot field because there weren't any birds in it. They were dead right, but there are now. And the crucial thing is to make more space for nature wherever we can and to show that it's working, to monitor progress. Every NIA has a comprehensive monitoring scheme in place. I have flippantly said, when people say, how will you know if the NIAs have worked? And I've said, when you walk across the boundary, you'll be able to hear the skylarks. You'll also be able to count them and all the other things. And there's a comprehensive monitoring scheme in place. The monitoring scheme for the NIAs has 4 elements: biodiversity, ecosystem services, social and economic benefits, and the measure of partnership working. And the NIA partnerships, all 12 of them, are committed to monitoring and evaluating their project over the next 3 years, and they're all required to make their data arising from the monitoring available to the National Biodiversity Network and, incidentally, also BARS. So there's a lot of exciting new information coming in, and they're committed to actually monitoring it for much longer than 3 years. So I want to just finish by thinking a little bit about, not just about NIAs, but some monitoring in general, echoing some of the wonderful things we heard this morning. I want to think about the reliability of volunteer recorders in a fairly light-hearted way. I want to think about the use of social media and citizen science, again in a fairly light-hearted way, and the potential of molecular techniques. There's a really interesting letter in British Birds in March this year from Richard Porter, one of the doyens of English bird watching, suggesting that the reason a lot of the species on his breeding bird survey square were declining was that he wasn't declining, it's just Richard was getting deaf. And as the cohort of measurement, as people studying breeding bird surveys gets older, the declines in species is not real. It's because, pardon, we're all going deaf. So I sort of conjured a picture in my mind. This is BTO data again, and these are all species that are declining, and I think they're studied by aging survey workers like me. These are species not changing at all, and they're by young survey workers, and this is species that are increasing, survey workers with deaf aids. Actually, it makes a very serious point. That is a quality of the BTO breeding bird survey data. You can show with exquisite detail what's happening to suites of species, all long-distance migrants, some declining, some stable, and some increasing, and we begin to understand why. That's the power of the volunteer recording sector when it's staggering, actually. This is modern media and citizen science. We heard a lot about citizen science this morning. Again, I found it absolutely fascinating. And I think all recording schemes are going to have to move to web-based recording, and I think the power of Twitter and other social networking sites is huge. The Hoverfly Recording Scheme is trialling the Big Hover Watch in May and June next year, like Big Garden Bird Watch. I can't understand the fascination of hoverflies. And basically, the basic citizen science, which we heard this morning from, and I think it's actually from Michael Pocock actually put this, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, the Intercol and the British Ecological Society are running a major meeting next year, and we're having a series of workshops. And one of the bids for a workshop was on citizen science, in which they were going to explain public-facing apps and EpiCollect and FieldScope and DIY Bio. I haven't a clue what any of that means. No idea. And actually that's worrying because we really do, I understand we need to get into these kinds of things, and I'm not the right person to do it, but we need to be sympathetic to those people, like we heard from Michael this morning, who really do understand this stuff and could actually transform the way we work. And taxonomists are increasingly using DNA barcodes for species identification. Not much said about that. The mitochondrial cytochrome oxidase 1 gene, for example. I do understand that. The Food and Environment Research Agency, FERA, which is based in York, of which I'm a non-executive board member, are actually developing now DNA sequencing technologies, nanopore sequencing, for example, and applying those techniques to identify, amongst other things, selected invertebrate groups, fungi, and algae. The time is not long off when we all have small handheld devices that think about them as being bug detectors rather than bat detectors. You'll be able to put a piece of an organism in, squash a hoverfly, and it'll tell you what species it is. It'll be amazing. So this is all terribly passé, this stuff. This is a penguin. Look at it carefully. Now, finally, if the National Biodiversity Network simply monitors in exquisite detail the continuing collapse of UK biodiversity, as well as the successes, but particularly the collapses, not least under the impacts of climate change, the question I would put to you, is it fit for purpose? National Biodiversity Network is not, I know perfectly well, a campaigning organisation or a lobby group. Let me ask you a question. Does fit for purpose include using the immense power and knowledge of the National Biodiversity Network to argue the case, probably behind the scenes, and you may be doing it for all I know, to make more space for nature? Or is that for other people to do using National Biodiversity Network, or is it for both of you to do, your clients and yourselves? I think that's an interesting question. I know what I hope the answer is, but it's for you to decide. Thank you. All right.
We've got time for a couple of questions.
Yeah, fine. You okay?
You happy with that?
Yeah.
We've got time for a couple of questions or so.
Can I go now?
Yes, one at the back there.
Right, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
It's Mark Stevenson at DEFRA. It would be interesting to get your view. You talked about monitoring protected area coverage so that we can report against the international targets. What's your view on how best to report on the connectivity targets? And in particular, looking at this morning's talks, can we make better use of species data to infer connectivity?
I think the only really, I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's quite a hard question, which is presumably why you asked it, because it's quite tricky. In terms of connectivity, I think the only way you can do it is by mapping. You've got to know where the habitats are in physical space and what the connections between them are. In Making Space for Nature, we did actually have a goal at scoring how connected the landscapes throughout England were. Some are much better connected than others. National parks tend to have high connectivity. If you're on the Vale of York, it's a very low connectivity. But it's geographical information systems and mapping. The problem is, if you've got two woodlands joined by a wetland, how do you count the wetland if you're interested in connectivity of woodland and so on? And it's really quite a hard problem. And so I've got nothing very helpful to say, except I think it has to be mapping, and I don't think the species presence and absence will tell you very much about the connectivity at all.
Yes, last question.
I was interested in your observation. Sorry, it's Roddy Fairley here from SNH in Scotland, but I'm going to ask you a question about England. I was interested in your observation about the extent to which the 17% target is or is not being achieved in England. But it then crossed my mind at what scale we should be thinking about this 17%. Should it only apply at national level, or would you actually aspire to have 17% of the English Midlands as protected for wildlife and nature as well?
Again, that's an interesting question. The Making Space for Nature panel, because it wasn't my report, it was produced by a panel of very skilled people. And one of the things we argued about was, should we try and have nature improvement areas everywhere, where you start off some areas from a very low base, and others where you've already got a lot of biodiversity? Or should you, if you've got £1 to spend and an acre to buy, should you concentrate on the areas that are good? You get a bigger bang for your buck if you go for the better areas. And we went backwards and forwards on that. And there isn't a simple answer. That's a sort of judgment and an ethical and moral judgment and so on. But if you then add to that the consideration that people shouldn't have to drive more than 50 miles to see something more interesting than a dandelion and a grey squirrel, then actually you are looking to have access to high quality green space for as many citizens as you possibly can without having to drive a long way. And then you begin to think about having habitat restoration and nature improvement areas as close to home as you can do it for everybody. And then you have some special areas, really big ones, called NIAs, that you, almost by definition, you're going to have to, put those. But though they're pretty well distributed around the country. So, like all these things, there's no scientific answer to that. It's an ethical, moral, judgmental issue about what you want people to experience, and the pleasures of access to wildlife. And the more we can make that easy for people, the better it will be.
Well, John has given us a quite superb lecture, but before we let him slump back in his chair, we do give our Burnett Memorial lecturers Burnett Memorial Medal. And I'd like to ask our patron, the Earl of Selborne, to come and present this medal to John.
Depends whether he's got a throttle me or not. It doesn't.
That does have a ring.
Thank you, John. Okay, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, on with the show, and our next speaker is Tom Hunt, who is the ALERC National Coordinator, and he's going to talk on complex mosaic or patchy mess, ? The current picture of local record centre data. Tom.
Right. How to follow that? I'll certainly give it a go. Trevor asked me if I'd be able to present at conference. I had a short period of time to make a decision and come up with a title, and that's what I went with. Something mildly controversial, only really to try and keep your attention. Well, what we're going to explore is what is ALERC, what local record centres are, and what we can do to improve, how good is the picture of local record centres in Britain, and what we can do to improve that. Before I move on, just in case you're interested, the complex mosaic is Roman mosaic from Sicily, which I think in the 3rd century, and you can see beach volleyball was popular then as it is now. And the patchy mess is Jackson Pollock, and it's called Autumn Rhythm or something like that. Anyway, this isn't an art lecture, so you don't have to get up and leave. Okay, so what is ALERC? The Association of Local Environmental Record Centres. It is a bit of a mouthful, and it can be a little bit tedious when I have to keep introducing myself to people. But that's, that it does what it says on the tin. It's a CIC, community interest company, formed in 2009, so we're still really only a baby compared to a lot of societies that we work with. 12 directors, all of whom are employed by local record centres. Some are managers, some are staff. One of whom is obviously the chair, Gary, who unfortunately can't be here today because of flooding in the southwest, and he's my manager. And just one member of staff, which is myself, and I started in January. So as an organisation with staff, we're even newer. I thought it's probably worthwhile having just a little go over what LRCs are. They've already been mentioned today by previous speakers, but it's worth, just for people who aren't aware of what they do, just going through them. LRCs, local environmental record centres, or just local record centres. The idea being to provide a local hub, a local centre of contact for naturalists. They could be just volunteer naturalists who just enjoy recording birds at their bird tables, or they could be part of a scheme and society. We tend to think of the NBN being a network between local record centres and national schemes and societies. I just want to put the concept out there of local schemes and societies. There are a lot of local schemes and societies, and for them, the local record centre can be a great place and provide a great service for networking, for digitisation of data, and so on and so forth. That's more the input side. The output side, of course, is the interpretation of data for local authorities, developers, and so on. Of course, sending data through to the gateway, acting as a conduit for data to reach the gateway. There's three main types. Some are hosted by local wildlife trusts, about 13 of those. Some of them are inside local authorities, county councils, and so on. And a few are completely independent. There aren't many of those. So a bit about me then, the role of the national coordinator. So this post was created, as I say, towards the end of January this year, so it is pretty new, to be fair. It has set outputs. It's not simply ALERC needs a member of staff, although ALERC does need a member of staff because it has a conference and it has a membership and all these other things that it needs to look after. But the post is largely funded through the NBN with DEFRA money, and so there are specific outputs that need to be reached through the post. And we'll go into those in a little bit more detail as I go through the presentation. As I say, started January 2012, and the contract is until the end of March 2014. I'd love to be able to tell you what will happen after that, but we don't know as yet. Okay, so one of the major parts of the role is to work with the NBN and NE. The post is steered by the ALERC directors, a representative from NBN Trust and a representative from Natural England, and we talk to each other once a month. These quotes come from the actual job description itself, and it gives you a flavour of what I'm trying to achieve. These are all things that are designed to make local record centres as a network work better as part of the NBN, work better on behalf of Natural England, who are obviously one of their main customers. So we've got specific items here looking at adoption of tools. That's referring to technical tools, bits of programming and that kind of thing. Data management tools, tools which can help validate, verify data, map data, so on and so forth. Raising awareness for wider adoption of online recording. That's a major section. I think Keith mentioned online recording this morning. This is a sort of quite a cutting edge thing, I think, even though some people, including local record centres, have been working on online recording for quite a while. But Keith talked about the efficiencies that it can produce. It can make data validation and verification a lot quicker, more efficient, possibly more reliable as well, and that's why we want a wider uptake of online recording. And so I'm an online recording advocate. I've snaffled these logos, only these ones, because I didn't have time to ask for permission for all logo use. There are other online recording systems available, and I know there are people in the room who have developed them, such as Adrian and Living Record. So there you go, Adrian, you've got an even better advert now by me missing that off. So continuing with working with the NBN and NE, you'll be aware that the data access controls on the gateway will be changing soon. There are significant issues contacting every local record centre to make sure that they set the parameters correctly to enable Natural England and other data users to be able to access data in the best possible resolution. I've been able to step in and sort of, I wouldn't say smooth over that process, but I think it's been very helpful for the NBN Trust and Natural England to have a single point of contact to get at local record centres and make sure they understand what the implications of the transition on the data access controls are. I've also been able to talk to them about the new interface which is coming through, so they've been able to feed back to the Trust through that. Of course, the other thing to make sure is that the record centres themselves, who are data users as well and use gateway data, understand the implications for that. Okay, another major aspect of this role is to, and this is sort of where I'm going to hopefully answer this question that I've set up. I've sort of set myself up with this question about complex mosaic or patchy mess, and now I've got to try and answer it. We've sort of framed this around possibly the historical difficulties with LRCs, difficulties in inverted commas, that have been set up over a long period of time. Some are old and established, some are new, some have strong support from local authority partners and other partners, and some don't. And this kind of leads to this perception of not a very, what's the word? Not a very good, smooth coverage of service across the country, of data provision, and so on and so forth. So obviously a major part of my role is to get to grips with that. So we used an example here, this particular critter, which has obviously been in the news quite a lot recently. We use the example of badger data. Badger groups, some of them can be reluctant to share data more widely for obvious reasons, to do with persecution, obviously. But some of them are. Some of them aren't reluctant. Some of them are very willing to share their data. And I know of examples where local record centres have been able to work very closely with local badger groups and reach agreements that mean that the badger data gets provided to the local record centre, gets used in the local planning context and sent to the NBN gateway. Of course, we're all about data sharing. We obviously feel that that enhances the badger's chances. So part of my role is to try and take those examples of best practice, of good working, and see if we can spread them across the country, which will hopefully yield more useful data and obviously in the long run help protect badgers. So we'll look into a little bit more detail and we'll sort of look inside a database of a particular LRC. I have to thank Cheshire here, Record in Cheshire, for giving me access to their database. That's the local record centre that I used to work for before I took this post. The point of this diagram is just to give you an example of how patchy some of the data sets can be. And obviously I've talked about the reasons for this, things like badger groups not releasing data. We've talked about recorder effort in previous presentations. I thought it'd be quite useful to sort of present it graphically. Basically, that's just a big patch, which is Cheshire. You can see the number of records per kilometre square. Some of these are enormous peaks. And some of them are just, there seems to be very little data at all. My point is that through spreading of best practice through ALERC, we can perhaps provide a better picture. We can look at some of these sort of geographical spots, and we'll move the slide on because I think we've got a better example yet. Some of these things like in the south of Cheshire, some of these areas where There may well be data from local groups, from local recorders, but we need to be able to find ways of persuading them to share the data, and maybe we can make this look a bit smoother and a bit less patchy. And of course, it's not just about geographical patchiness. There's also patchiness between species groups. Some people like bat groups as well. They're not always that willing to share data which could be very important and very useful for conservation of their species. Okay, let's throw another thing out there. This is less about the actual data, but more about the service provision. One of the things I was able to do in the summer was work with IEM on a survey of consultants to try and gauge the variability of LRC service provision. LRCs provide services to ecological consultants, i.e. they provide data, which can be used in planning applications and so on and so forth. And a lot of the time when we have these conversations with consultancies, we get this sort of dichotomous argument about some people think, oh yeah, LRC's great. Some people think, oh yeah, LRC's rubbish. That's not a useful argument at all, as far as I'm concerned. What I wanted to do is have some way of quantifying it, some measure of satisfaction, and actually see how variable the service provision is. Well, I wouldn't necessarily expect you to read all of these, but you can see that there are some significant areas, things surrounding costs, which can often be a problem in the eyes of the consultants. You get, well, there are very few where people say there are no problems at all. So you can build a picture of the amount of variability between local record centres. You can break it down and we can try and isolate some of the actual significant problems and therefore improve service that way. So what are the things that we can actually do to improve this situation? What are the things that I'm trying to do to improve this situation? One of the new aspects is LRC accreditation. So like other professional forms of accreditation, what we're working to is a minimum set of standards for these three areas: organisation, data custodianship and service provision. And what that means is that each local record centre, if it wants to be accredited, and as far as I'm aware most of them do, which is a good start, will have to meet certain criteria in order to pass accreditation, and that way will give data users and data suppliers more confidence that what the LRC is doing is the best possible practice. Other things, little things, for example, here we've got sharing tools and ways of working. This little bit in the backdrop is a website that or web page that I set up on our website, which didn't take very long to do. And all it does is pool information on IT systems, IT tools, databases, things like that LRCs themselves have developed. Lists them with their availability, whether they can be shared, whether they can be shared at a cost. And this is a relatively straightforward thing to do, but had never been done before. And already people are using it, going on there with a problem, trying to find out if somebody else has found a solution. The ALERT conference is very important for local record centres to be able to get together and share ideas about best practice. It's also important for some other outside organisations to get in touch with us that way. The ALERT conference is currently unsponsored. There's a vacancy there if anyone's interested. And of course, now with a national coordinator in place, there is actually somebody who can dedicate all of their time to doing all of this, because previously any work on this side of things was done by LRC staff who were volunteering time out of their own jobs. Okay, working towards best practice. Well, we've talked a little bit about this already, working with NBN trusts on things like online recording projects. That's trying to make or trying to persuade LRCs to take up online recording where they can, and to give them ways of doing that. That means advertising workshops that the Trust put on, but also trying to help those LRCs who have already developed online recording websites to further develop them so that they conform to national standards, which again is something that Keith talked about this morning. Also working with other outside organisations. As I said before, for the first time now, LRCs, there is a single point of contact for LRCs, which there wasn't previously. I think that probably makes quite a big difference for people like DEFRA, Natural England, or people like BRC, or national schemes and societies. And I can tell that makes a difference because of the amount of contact that I do get off these people. And it means that there's somebody who can spend time coordinating responses from LRCs to outside organisations and vice versa. I think that makes a big difference. So, conclusions. I think I've probably rattled through that, so hopefully there's lots of time for questions. I think when we look at local record centres in isolation, like we just did with Cheshire, we can see sort of blurry dots that don't necessarily make a better picture, a bigger picture. I think through ALERC and the way it allows the LRCs to interface between each other, but also interface with the important national organisations and the governmental organisations, we can go from this sort of blurry image to something more like that. Now, as many of you will know, these two were both from the same painting. So yes, I think this is probably where the metaphor ends now. But where we zoom out, we look at the big national picture, and it makes a lovely picture like that. And that, for me, is what the role of the ALERC National Coordinator is all about. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got, don't go away, we've got a few minutes for questions if anybody has any. Mark.
Mark Hill, British Biological Society. One of the gripes that national societies have against local record centres is that they persist in putting up data that we, the great authorities, on what really is there, isn't there. Is there any way of trying to sort of, as it were, have a general purpose gripe where one could say we don't like these records, or does one have to write to every single record centre individually?
So are you talking about unverified data? Yes. Well, I don't think it's unrealistic to suggest that we can get rid of that problem altogether. When I was working in Cheshire, I spent a lot of time talking to local experts who had exactly the same problem, quite often to be fair, and we were exploring ways of dealing with this problem of verification. Well, the online recording system that is used in Cheshire allows this verification to be done by those very experts in question before the data is published. Now, if we can get local record centres all to adopt some system like that, that's brilliant. We can cut it off at source. The other thing is accreditation. To be accredited, local record centres will need to show that they have verification systems in place, even if these are more old-fashioned sort of paper-based systems. So obviously, if people want to continue griping, they can gripe to me and to the local record centre in question, and I can help the local record centre in question. But hopefully, maybe even by next year's conference or conference after that, this won't be an issue because we can cut it off at source.
Yes.
I worked for a record centre for 4 years, and one thing I think is a major thing is data flow, where you're saying about working with IWM.
Yeah.
Record centre see data flow as a one-way out, and we don't get anything back from consultants, despite their guidelines saying they should do, as well as the terms of any kind of licensing. But from a consultant point of view, which I've never been, I can imagine the questions regarding accreditation I personally think it's a great idea, but our local record centres, not particularly good. They're not supportive of the local record groups. I chair a local record group, and I have a lot of trouble persuading them that we need to feed the records into Record Centre in the first place. But local consultants have no other choice. They have to, if they go to the planning committee, they have to have a desktop survey. So it doesn't matter whether they're accredited or not. They can't go anywhere else. And I don't know how you would persuade them of an accreditate or what you plan to get from it.
Right. Well, yes, there's always going to be a scenario sort of tough with where you have tough nuts to crack. I think, obviously, those record centres that are accredited first, and there are 2 that are accredited under the pilot scheme, and the next ones that are coming up in the first part of next year will be local record centres that are pretty well developed and already meet many of the standards, and that's great, but that leaves us with a lot of the others, which I think are the sort of local record centres that you're talking about. What I would hope is that as time progresses and more local record centres become accredited, we'll reach a situation where people are almost embarrassed not to be accredited, if that makes sense. There may come a time, to be frank, where IEM actually say, well, we no longer want to deal with local record centres that aren't accredited, and we can discuss that as and when it happens. And the other point that you make about data coming from consultants, this is an issue that I'm working with the NBN Trust on, and it is difficult. And I have got statistics to show sort of percentages of consultants that think that they do give data to LRCs, and percentages from the LRC's point of view, if that makes sense, which I didn't want to show because I don't want to embarrass people. But that's really what inspired me to do the survey that showed the differing levels of service provision. The idea being that if we can isolate these, tackle them, show improvement, then the LRCs have kind of done their half of the bargain, and it's now time for the consultants, who at the end of the day are going to have to take some time out of their day-to-day work, even if it's a small period of time, to submit the data. So does that answer the question? Cheers.
Yes, over there.
Yes.
Hello, Sarah Wild here. Going back to Mark Hill's point about unverified data appearing to come from LRCs, wouldn't it simplify it if instead of pouring resources into setting up online recording schemes, actually getting local record centres to work more profitably with county recorders? Because surely, in an ideal world, every local record centre would work closely with every county recorder from every taxonomic group. They would have their data, they would share data, so every biological record held by an LRC would already be verified. Would it not be more profitable to do that, to actually come up with a package for every record centre so they know how to work with county recorders?
Well, I believe that that is what the online recording should be called online recording verification. That's what it does. The local record centre that I was at in Cheshire, we had a fantastic relationship with virtually every county recorder, if not every county recorder. Once we had set up an electronic system that meant they could verify records from home, no record would be published by the local record centre that hadn't been through that system. There are other local record centres that I know that don't use online recording systems but do work well with county recorders or only receive data from county recorders. So I don't think this is true to say that this is necessarily a common picture across the country. I'm sure there will be LRCs that have fallen out with county recorders, or where the county recorders don't necessarily have the time available to go through all the data that comes into the local record centre. But the point about online recording is it increases efficiency by allowing the internet to help us solve a lot of these problems. It means that it's easier to get in contact with the county recorders, and it is easier for them to pass comment on records. So I don't think it's the either-or scenario that you're suggesting. I think investment in things like online recording will actually achieve what you're after.
Last question.
Just really picking up that last point. I'm not quite sure I understand what you're proposing, because it suggests to me that you're proposing that we duplicate what national schemes and societies are doing locally within local record centres. And I don't think that's what local record centres are about. I think we, by and large, do work with our county recorders, and we do identify data flows, and where there is perfectly good data flow that goes from a county recorder to a national scheme and society, then the position of a lot of record centres will be to discuss with national scheme and society and the county recorders how we then get that data back from the national scheme and society. I think the idea that we build a model where local record centres replicate locally what national scheme and societies already do extremely well is a huge retrograde step. I'm kind of disappointed to hear that that's the position that we're discussing at this conference.
Can I answer that briefly? I think that's exactly right. One of the things, when I'm in conversations about verification, one of the points that I do keep making is that we don't reroute systems that already work. There are instances, though, where LRCs won't have access to verifiers. We know about those, and that's where national scheme and society verifiers can come in, and an online system makes that a lot easier to administer. But yeah, you'd be mad to reroute systems or flows that already work, and I'm a strong advocate of that.
Okay.
Just raise one point.
Yeah.
I think you're actually historically put the cart before the horse there. There'll be a lot of things that haven't got schemes yet that are still being recorded by the public going to the record centre or the county recorder. There's no online facility.
And that's absolutely.
The correct picture of the online scheme can seriously there and put the county recorders in. Because as a county recorder for Moss, there's only recently been developments, and there was an online development that wasn't suitable that took the heads to get together to make it more suitable. So the picture of creating is slightly disingenuous.
It's not what I was suggesting. What I was suggesting is where there's a system that works, don't break it and add an extra loop in it.
This is
plenty of
how
work.
online streaming is without the county recorders being involved. It's the management of the LRCs that are doing this and not the county recorders.
Well, you can pass, if you want to pass specific examples to me afterwards, I'm quite happy to take them up. Okay,
thank you. Interesting discussion. I feel it could have gone on, but we must. The next talk is by Sarah Wilde from the University of Birmingham and the BSBI, and her talk is entitled Axiophytes Using Plant Indicators for Landscape Conservation.
Right, good afternoon. I must apologise for being here under false pretences. I'm not Sarah Wilde from the University of Birmingham. I'm delighted to say I'm Sarah Wilde from Manchester Metropolitan University. And that will probably mean absolutely nothing to many members of the audience, but I think to some of you it may be something a little more significant. So before I start talking about Axiophytes, I should like to thank and salute everyone who wrote letters, signed petitions, and sent over 4,000 emails to the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Birmingham. So, without further ado, I'm going to talk to you about Axiophytes in the landscape, or I fear everything you wanted to know, or possibly more you wanted to know than you wanted to know about Axiophytes. So, today I'm here wearing two hats. I'm also here under false pretenses because I'm not really the lead researcher on Axiophytes. That's Alex Lockton from the BSBI. But I've had several postgraduate students over the past few years who have produced excellent research on Axiophytes, and I am going to present some of their data today. So, Axiophytes, what on earth are they? Well, what the BSBI started off doing was attempting to quantify this feeling that botanists get when you get onto a site and you think, ooh, that's nice. How do you quantify that niceness? There are particular species that invoke that response in you. Not necessarily always vascular plants. Sometimes bryophytes might provoke that similar response too. And, well, I hesitate to say hoverflies. But Axiophytes, what are they? Generally, they're meant to be positive indicators. And this here is a bed of Carex riparian, greater pond sedge, that in most parts of Britain, if you get a vascular plant botanist walking into that sort of habitat, they will have that ooh response. So how do we go about quantifying it? Well, Axiophytes, the BSBI actually ran a competition to come up with the name for these positive ecological indicators, so Axiophytes, or worthy plants, literally. They've been used by the BSBI as a way of creating these lists of indicator species for vice counties throughout Britain and Ireland. And the idea was that we could then use these lists for conservation and planning, not just for sites, but for wider landscape use. Okay, so how do we actually determine what is an Axiophyte? So an Axiophyte is a species that is restricted to Biodiversity Action Plan habitats for 90% of its records, and it should be found in 25% or fewer tetrads within the vice county. So what you can then do is allocate those Axiophytes to broad habitat types. Now, you can make an exception to that 25% rule if you end up with some species in conservation habitats that are particularly well represented and widespread within that vice county. So the Axiophyte scheme has been running for quite a few years now, and most of the vice counties have got Axiophyte lists. And they have been put to various purposes. And these are some of the purposes that I'd like to talk to you about today. They can be used for assessing and, most importantly, quantifying county wildlife sites. They can be used for site selection and for monitoring. They can be used for prioritising sites for habitat restoration and identifying landscape units for broadleaf tree planting. That's a very specific case study that we did in Shropshire. So first of all, what I'd like to do is talk about some of the work that Jeremy Ison and Richard Aisbett have done in Devon and Wiltshire. And here we go, we've got yet another Axiophyte here that should produce the ooh response from a vascular plant botanist. And this is tubular water dropwort, Enanthe fistulosa, which usually grows in good quality habitats, and it's also a national priority species. So, what Jeremy did in Devon was to look at a whole range of aspects of Axiophytes. And he looked at how effective Axiophytes are as a measure of site condition, which is quite important, and whether or not significantly more Axiophytes were recorded for high-quality sites than those of low quality. So can you actually use the numbers of Axiophytes to discriminate between sets of sites? Do grid squares containing designated sites have more Axiophytes than those that don't?
Are individual Axiophytes more likely to occur in high-quality sites? And can we use coincidence maps of Axiophytes to allow for targeted surveying at a landscape scale? So what I'm going to talk to you about with respect to Jeremy's work was how effective the Axiophytes are as a measure of site quality. And in Devon, county wildlife sites were previously assessed using IHS, the Integrated Habitat System, which doesn't necessarily require any species identification to have taken place. And one of the issues that the site selection group came up with, that there needn't necessarily be any empirical evidence in the form of validated biological records when deciding which sites should be county wildlife sites or not. So here are a couple of maps produced by the Devon Biodiversity Group. And this is a map of broad habitat types in Devon. And you might just be able to pick out various types of habitat. We've got upland heath, large area of this, and a lot more complex habitat round here. And then, if we have a look at a coincidence map of Axiophytes in Devon, we can see that, on the whole, the more Axiophytes you've got, i.e. the darker or hotter the colour, they're picking out these complex areas. And, OK, Axiophytes grow in nice habitat. That's actually called no-shit Sherlock ecology. And with the interesting exception that if we look at the upland heath here, go quick back to the habitat map, there are relatively few Axiophytes there. But when I come on to a later case study, we'll see how you can include bryophytes as Axiophytes as well to account for habitat types that are naturally low in vascular plant indicators. OK, so 416 Axiophytes were identified for Devon. Now, there are a lot of county wildlife sites in Devon. And Jeremy analysed data for 29 that were approved as county wildlife sites and 23 that had been rejected using the IHS scheme, together with a panel of local experts. And he looked at the idea that a threshold of 20 Axiophytes would be needed to qualify as county wildlife site. And this was used to predict which sites would be accepted at the selection panel meeting. And Jeremy's prediction model worked extremely well. And 2 of the sites that would have been accepted by the Axiophyte method were rejected, and 6 that would have been rejected were accepted out of a total of 41 sites. So that did work pretty well as a predictor. Now, Richard was working in Wiltshire and came up with a very similar model. He identified 311 Axiophytes for Wiltshire. And what he concentrated on doing, first of all, he did look at the number of Axiophytes in designated and non-designated sites. So Wiltshire nature reserves had 45, SSSIs had an average of 46, but unprotected county wildlife sites had 24. And so again, it was fairly straightforward to propose a cut-off point for designation for SSSIs and for county wildlife sites. But more interestingly, what Richard found in Wiltshire, using coincidence maps of Axiophytes, he found you could then target new sites by looking for hotspots in the coincidence map that weren't already designated. And this is one of the real targeted uses for Axiophyte coincidence mapping. You can discover new sites of conservation value, and you can then target those, go out and survey them, and see if the sites themselves do actually meet the criteria. Okay, well, I'm going to move on now to where I've been using Axiophyte data, working on the meres and mosses. And we've been using Axiophytes for prioritising conservation work in the meres and mosses. So in the meres and mosses natural area, as you might expect, the wetland species are the most important ones. So what we did, the county recorders for Shropshire, Cheshire and Staffordshire, which are the 3 main counties in the meres and mosses natural area, drew up an Axiophyte list and then specifically drew up lists of wetland Axiophytes. 123 species were chosen, including 18 bryophytes, mostly sphagnum, so that we could pick out the mosses, the peat bogs. And we then produced a coincidence map of these species, and I apologise, this isn't as pretty as the Devon one. So this is a coincidence map using numbers, but what we could then do is pick out the hot spots, pick out the sites, and start prioritising them. So what we did first of all was to rank all of the sites with total Axiophyte species richness across time. And this was a really interesting exercise. At the top one is the mere at Ellesmere, which has had an 86% decline in its Axiophytes over time. It had a total of 76, it's only got 11. It used to be an SSSI, it's been denotified. And the next top one is Bowmere Pool, which has also had an 86% decline. Interestingly enough, Bowmere Pool is still an SSSI and is in good condition. So this was quite an interesting exercise to see where the declines were, where the total Axiophytes were ever, and how many Axiophytes they still had. So what we then did was take the 4 sites with the largest total decline in the number of species, and what you can then do is break down the Axiophyte data by date class, and this then helps you to pick up variations in recording effort and scope of survey, which was something that Nick mentioned this morning as being possibly one of the biggest variables in biological recording. Now, the BSBI uses date classes for its data, and date class 1, which is 1930 to 1969, is noticeably under-recorded in all the sites, but all of the other date classes do have comparable recording effort. And I think because of the nature of the meres and mosses, that they have fairly specific boundaries within a matrix of relatively uninteresting habitat, and apologies to Cheshire and North Shropshire folk. So these were the 4 top sites. We've got the mere at Ellesmere, which is no longer a triple SI. So it used to have a lot, and now it's got hardly any. Got Hencote Pool, that used to have a lot, and now it's hardly got any. Bowmere Pool, used to have a lot, now it's hardly got any. Oh, and Whitemere. Now, interestingly enough, Whitemere appears to have had a bit of a catastrophic event there, but then it had a lot of Axiophytes recorded in date class 2. And what that tends to suggest is that its decline has been more recent. So what we can then do by time slicing the data, this can allow us to target sites more specifically. And you could make an argument for prioritising resources on Whitemere, because if the changes have been more recent, they are more likely, you could argue, to be reversible. And just to give you an idea that not all of the sites follow that particular pattern, Sweatmere, the classic site for succession, a site that has remained in favourable condition with very little change in numbers of Axiophytes over time. So we can bore into the data even more thoroughly. What do we do about Whitemere? We can look at the different type of habitats there. So there's carr, there's grassland, there are marginal species. The dry woodland is in favourable condition, but marginal species have been hit hard. So most of the species are light-loving, of open, wetter conditions. So what we can tell from that is that the shade has increased. What do we do in order to restore those Axiophytes? Remove trees from the water's edge in appropriate places. And those could be some of our target species. So what that allowed us to do in the meres and mosses area is look how conservation resources can be focused on sites with the greatest number of Axiophytes. And it can also tell you where perhaps the greatest urgency is for sites where you've got a demonstrable decline in recent years. Now, one of the problems with this, it can only be detected retrospectively. So evidence of recent loss of Axiophytes could be proposed as a trigger for intervention. And of course, Whitemere is the site with the highest and most recent decline. So we can use these Axiophyte data tables to monitor for further change in the meres and mosses. And the more frequently the sites are thoroughly surveyed, the more powerful this technique becomes. Because as Nick pointed out this morning, scope of survey is really important. But because these are discrete sites, one of the advantages of the meres and mosses is that they do tend to have been surveyed thoroughly over time. Okay, well, the final case study I'd like to finish off on is something that we did in Shropshire. We worked with Shropshire Council and the Forestry Commission. In 2006, the Forestry Commission wanted to produce a woodland opportunity map. Where can they plant broadleaf trees to increase biodiversity, etc. So what we proposed was that we could use woodland and grassland Axiophytes that would provide an evidence-based approach to mapping, because we didn't particularly want the Forestry Commission to acquire nice bits of species-rich grassland and plant up trees there. So we used the standard Axiophyte method, and we used specific woodland Axiophytes and grassland Axiophytes, and we then handed the raw data to an absolutely brilliant GIS technician who did wonderful things with it. So that's what our raw data could look like. We have a list of species against habitats, and those are the actual biological records. Well, okay, missing a recorder, but we've got the species and the date and the tetrad. So from that, we can then start producing coincidence maps of both the grassland species and the woodland species. And this is where it gets tricky and goes completely over my head, because the landscape descriptor units were then mapped onto tetrads, and by applying various algorithms, they could calculate the likelihood of species within particular tetrads being within particular landscape descriptor units, turning a grid-based coincidence map to a landscape descriptor coincidence map. And what that then allowed them to do was to produce a planting map for the Forestry Commission. And what that actually means, I mean, it's a very pretty map, but the complex areas are those which are hatched brown. The sensitive areas, i.e., please don't plant anything in these lovely areas here because they have got good grassland. The pale creamy colour is neutral. Well, you know, you could do whatever you like there, but the preferred areas are the green areas. And these are not on species-rich grassland, but they are adjacent to concentrations of ancient woodland Axiophytes. And the Forestry Commission were delighted with this because they realised that if they did planting in those particular areas, they then wouldn't get a really hard time from the local county recorders in particular. So the resulting map showed where they could plant and get away with it. And I suppose the main thing is that the applications of that is that you've got an evidence-based approach. And the West Midlands Biodiversity Group took on that methodology and are applying it to other habitats. So, Axiophytes, are they useful? Well, they certainly have the potential to be. It's using bulk data, a lot of vascular plant and bryophyte data at a fairly coarse scale, but it is dependent very much on scope of survey. So they can provide insights into how to assess sites empirically using an evidence-based approach. And I think I was quite surprised to find out how county wildlife sites are usually designated. There are panels in most county where they will sit round and consider which sites should be county wildlife sites and which ones shouldn't. But coming up with an empirical system for that and saying, well, you know, do they have the relevant number of Axiophytes if they're important for vascular plants? If not, then they don't qualify. And of course, if you're then defending this in a structure plan or at a public inquiry, you then have empirical data rather than just a gut feeling. The point is that Axiophytes indicate favourable conditions, and generally speaking, the more Axiophytes you've got, the better quality the habitat. They're not just vascular plants, they can include bryophytes, and so far they seem to have been used to answer fairly specific questions on site conservation, prioritisation and landscape scale issues such as the Woodland Opportunities Map. Like all biological records, they need to be used with a small degree of caution. And going back to Nick's point this morning, scope of survey is vitally important. You do need to be able to compare like data with like data. But hopefully, as we amass more and more good quality, verified botanical records, we should be able to turn Axiophytes into a more and more powerful tool. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We've got time for a few questions. That was a great talk. Thank you very much. We do have some time for questions. Jim.
You're clearly taking a botanist view of the world, and you were using it to prioritise the identification of conservation areas. Is there any reason to believe that our hypothetical hoverfly person would be as enthusiastic about Axiophytes as you are, or indeed any other invertebrate recorder would share your enthusiasm?
I should hope not. And actually, Pete Boardman from the Field Studies Council, who I think has already left, is actually working on the concept of axiozoon lists for use at a vice county level. Now, obviously, in taxonomic terms, that's monstrous. It's a huge task. But obviously, for particular groups, especially hoverflies, then I think that this is something that could be quite valuable. Yeah, it only answers botanical questions.
Any other questions?
Sarah, with your succession site, that seemed to have fewer Axiophytes to begin with than the very good ones that then declined. So I'm wondering to what extent Axiophytes are very broad brush, so that you can have perhaps 15 Axiophytes at a certain stage, and then later on you've got 15 Axiophytes, but they're a completely different set of species. And I'm wondering to what extent you could possibly combine Axiophytes with something like Ellenberg, where you've got your fairly selective species, but that would also show perhaps changing conditions as well as it still being good for worthy species of some sort.
Absolutely. I mean, you're quite right, Steve, that using Ellenberg values, in fact, Richard and I think Jeremy as well, used Ellenberg values when they were doing their finer analysis of Axiophytes. Because, yes, Sweatmere is a site that over the last couple of hundred years has changed. It used to be open water, it's gone through Carr, and it's almost entirely wet woodland now. It's still in good condition, but it's different. So you're right, just the numbers of Axiophytes don't tell you the nature of change, but you would have to go to something like Ellenberg and CSR and so forth to find out actually the nature of the change.
Thank you. Just a brief question. I just wondered, having seen all these lists and sort of worked through working out what the Axiophytes are, how stable do you reckon the lists will be? Is it likely that we might add things to or take them from the lists, given that everything's changing so much at the moment? Will there be a cut-off point at which we would say, actually, that isn't really an Axiophyte anymore? Or will we add to them because some things become an Axiophyte? I mean, I'd hate to think common daisies might be. I suppose one day maybe we'd think they were. I don't know. But do you see it as a fairly fluid list, or would you like to think of it as fairly stable?
They were designed to be fluid, and taking a non-botanical example of house sparrows. I mean, species do decline quite dramatically, and yes, they were intended to be flexible. And I drew up the list for Shropshire, Vice County 40, and I have certainly added and subtracted species over the last 5 years.
Okay, thank you very much. The next talk is entitled River Recording 10 Years On, and it was going to be given by Craig McAdam from Bug Life and the Ephemeroptera Recording Scheme. Unfortunately, Craig has injured his hand and is unable to join us, but Ian Wallace has kindly agreed to step in at the last minute to make the presentation, and Ian is Curator of Conchology and Aquatic Biology at the National Museums in Liverpool. Hi there. Thanks very much.
That's who I am. I might say I'm delighted to be asked to give a talk and to stand in for Craig, mainly because your street cred not half goes up among your friends when you say I'm giving a talk at the Royal Society. Anyway, that's me. I'm a caddis scheme organiser. Obviously, work closely with Craig on the mayflies, and they're the 4 organisations that I suppose I'm associated with. So what are riverflies? They're 3 groups of insects, not closely related taxonomically, but quite small insect orders. And they've got a terrestrial adult stage and the quite well-known aquatic larval stage. The name riverflies, we operate as separate schemes, but we realised that there was a lot of advantage in combining our activities. And the name Riverflies was suggested to us, and it seems to have caught the public's imagination and represents our collaborations, which have been official since 2004. We're also, we were quite instrumental, key partners in setting up a thing called the Riverfly Partnership, which is all about recording riverflies, etc. I hope I'm going to cover in the talk just a brief history of riverfly recording, what we record, why we record it, and how our data collection might change in the future. I think it'd be unfortunate if we gave the impression that riverfly recording was something really new, because recording these inverts for freshwater, for water quality assessment, I mean, this has been going on certainly in earnest since 1981, and there are hundreds of thousands of records have been assembled by the Environment Agency and by consultants working for them. It's a quite simple thing. I'll just run it through it, but you'll all know you record the number of families in a sample. Because each family varies in its tolerance to pollution, you can give them a score, you add up the scores, you get a water body total, and you compare that against a standard to see how stressed your water body is. Pretty familiar stuff. And it was set up originally in 1981, the Biological Monitoring Working Party, and that's had a number of refinements or improvements with it, such as that as ASPT, RIVPACs, and the LIFE system, and so on. But one thing was very definite about that sort of work. You've got to fill in forms like that, quite complicated forms. There's all the lists of the families, and there's the scores that you give them. So the overall impression you get very clearly about Riverfly Recording is that it's a job for professionals, and you've got to have fancy equipment. You might not think the chap on the right is using very fancy equipment, but how many of you go out on a Sunday walk carrying chest waders and a pond net? I do sometimes, but, well, that's different. So it was a job for professionals, and the amateur didn't have a part to play, really. It was compounded also by the fact that when you'd collected the specimens, you usually had to preserve them in alcohol solutions, which were very difficult for the amateur to get hold of. And all in all, they were not popular with amateurs. And then along comes citizen science. Now, when I first started, when I was asked by a group, which started at the Natural History Museum, to get involved in this water quality monitoring for amateurs, I didn't know I was involved in citizen science. It wasn't until, in fact, I was approached by the University of Lancaster Social Sciences Department that actually it occurred to me that I might be doing something significant in terms of public appreciation of science. And we had a lot of testing and development, and that led to the launch of a thing known as the Angler Monitoring Initiative. The original thought was that though the average member of the public might not walk around on his Sunday outings with a pair of chest waders and a pond net, anglers often did. So that was what was set up in 2005, and that led in 2007 to the publication of this sort of guidelines, handbook for how it should be done, river invertebrate monitoring for anglers. To the right of it are examples of, from this guide of the groups that you might record. There's instructions how to do the job, and there's a recording sheet. Note that on the recording sheet there are only 8 categories of taxon that you actually record. Well, quite different from the enormous number that you have to record, or a comparatively enormous number for BMWP. So that's what you have to do. But it's important, and this was a really vital element of it right from the very start, that although anybody can now buy that handbook and can have a go, if you want to submit data to a recording group monitoring a river, and then ultimately to the NBN as well, then you have to be trained. And we have angler monitoring training courses, and that's pictures of a training course taking place on the River Allen, or the Avon Allen in North Wales. You're trained in how to take the sample and then how to identify what you find. And you get a qualification, which can fit into and be put on your wall if you want to. But it's important. It emphasises that you do need training to get proper data, because we want to make use of that data. The angler certainly led the way, but it's very interesting that most of the new monitoring groups are coming, as I say, from the conservation movement. So we've renamed it Riverfly Monitoring to reflect that. Lots of people want to take part in this and to monitor their local rivers. It's very important as well to realise how close a collaboration has been between the professionals and the amateurs. The method we use, and that's the sampling collection method, is identical to that used by the Environment Agency. That's catching the sample. Where we differ radically is in the analysis. Let's say their example, 19 caddis families possible, but we've only got 2 riverfly classes, cased and caseless. And the great advantage of that is that we can convert EA data down to the level of riverfly monitoring, so we can compare their data for a river with our new data. And that is very important because a vital element of this involves a thing called trigger levels. Every group has a mentor from the Environment Agency. This mentor takes part in the training. This mentor ensures that standards are maintained. And they use their data to what they work out are called trigger levels of abundance. So if you go out and you sample using this proper, correct method, and you find that the figures are below the trigger level, you think, right, there might be a problem, so you go out and do another survey, and if that survey still shows that you've got a problem, then you call the EA, and they will come out and have a look. The EA was cheesed off by the continual ring of phone calls. Please, my river's dead. And they would go out and find that the river wasn't dead. So we had to establish a credibility. We had to overcome this credibility gap. And as they know, if it's been done by a proper Riverfly monitoring group, and they say, we've got a problem, the likelihood is there is a problem, and certainly deserves investigation. It's made up data, but it gives an example of where Riverfly monitoring is at its best, really. And on this particular river, the Environment Agency thought it was just a mediocre river because every time it surveyed, it was getting mediocre data. What the angler monitoring revealed was that there were periodically, it was having a severe pollution event, and it was recovering, and it just so happened that the 2 yearly, and at that time the EA was doing 2 samples a year, its samples were missing this pollution incident. It's interesting, it probably could be completely coincidental, but once the general knowledge went round, the local locality that anglers were regularly monitoring once a month, the pollution seemed to stop. So we don't know what it was, but just the knowledge that there was somebody out there monitoring every month seems to have had an effect. Certainly, we've had a lot of success, especially in South Wales, where some problems, which were initially detected by angler monitoring, have been picked up, and we've had very significant fines imposed. But, sometimes you don't need to go out and you don't have to take an invertebrate sample to know that there's a problem in your river. Now, you might wonder about the quality of the data. Well, it has been tested against BMWP. As I say, the actual quality of the monitoring, we rely upon the Environment Agency to be happy that individual groups are doing a reasonable job. But as a method, it was tested against the BMWP, and it found it was as good. If you wanted to be detecting poor quality, then it was very good. It didn't differentiate so well between the good and the very good, because simply the higher the level of identification you go, the better the answer you get. You've had some fairly sophisticated data analysis, but so I apologise if this seems to be a bit patronisingly simple. But if you imagine you've got 2 rivers, Good River has 2 families of stonefly, and in a sample you've got 10 stoneflies. In the Better River you've got 4 families, but again you've only got about 10 stoneflies in the sampling tray. Well, those would both score exactly the same using Riverfly monitoring, but BMWP would pick up that Better River was better. But the angler monitoring has been at its best. Its principal purpose was to detect these transitory or pollution levels which would otherwise not be picked up by just occasional samples from the Environment Agency, and also to provide believable data so that when there was a problem, it could be picked up and not dismissed or not cause irritation, not make this credibility gap between the Environment Agency and the anglers. And I think one of its big pluses has been the bringing those 2 often conflicting groups and together, both to appreciate the value the other has. So, noting that in mind, increasing the number of categories we might be able to record would certainly improve Riverfly recording, and that's a goal for the future. We could, in the long term, imagine all this data being collected. You could really build up a long-term data set for a river site, and we could use that for a variety of purposes. For example, you might, in the long term, detect climate change. And I'm not just saying this alone. Professor Steve Ormerod of Cardiff University believes in the long term, Riverfly monitors could start providing quite a lot of useful data along that line. And then we've had all this morning. It's popular, it's hands-on science, all the usual things which citizen science has to offer. We are setting up a centralized data set which would be made available via the NBN. That is in process as far as I know, which will enable different angling monitoring groups to see how other groups are doing, which will help produce coherence, help increase enthusiasm. We've got 80 monitoring groups operating, and we've been able to appoint 3 full-time organisers, so it's going well. It's going well. It's all looking good. But, and I want to leave that but just hanging in the air while we look at another monitoring group. Now, it's important to realise this data that I'm talking about, it's a quite, I won't use the term crude level, but it's at a lower level of taxonomic identification. For example, case caddis, caseless caddis. I can't use that in a recording scheme. I can't map that sort of data. A lot of the Environment Agency data was at family level data. Again, even at that level, the recording schemes, it's difficult to map the family level identification data. But if we then go on to the traditional recording schemes, which are the Riverfly recording schemes, that's who we are. That's what we are hoping in the long term to be. They're champions, produce identification guides, training, courage recording, research and conservation. No different from any other recording scheme. And let's have a look at them. Ephemeroptera recording scheme, and look at the source of its records. Very interestingly, it has picked up the large number. If you add up Environment Agency, CEH, SEPA, in other words, the sort of statutory agency monitorers, they account for the vast majority of the data in the Ephemeroptera recording scheme. And not surprisingly, 99% of its records are of larvae, but all the data is on the NBN gateway. Caddis recording scheme, 1976, I set that up, and that's the map of, that's the number of records. Now, I like that map because you can't tell where I live, and that is one of the signs that I think of a good map. You're starting to get decent coverage when you can't tell where the scheme organiser lives. 248,000 records, but only 45% of those are from the monitoring agencies. And we've got a lot of historic data. I've been able to do the literature search, looking around in museums. And as a result of that, a good 30% of mine are adults. I can say I'm really happy. It's all with the BRC now, and they're working on it now to go on the NBN. The Plecopter scheme, Craig would have been able to say more about that because he's assisting this well, but essentially it has got most of its data from the statutory agencies and also on the NBN. And this is species-level data. I think it's really interesting when you think that although the Environment Agency was principally involved in recording at family level, it still managed to produce about 300,000 species-level records for those 3 quite obscure groups. It also shows how frequently riverflies are recorded and how important they are in water quality monitoring. Now, the quality of the species-level data, well, we do try to check against existing records and specimens, or we try and assess them as probable by the scheme organiser. The use of this data, well, yes, it is a source of site-specific species data, so it can be used for the traditional conservation purposes. But I think particularly where we fit into as part of this overall data mix, I think, is giving this overall picture of a species distribution. And we cover it provides us with this data for the future. And I want to mention this other thing, this record cleaner, it's often called, but essentially it's a verification rule, and this is very exciting. I find this very exciting indeed. We're working with BRC to produce this criteria against which any record coming into the NBN can be assessed for its probable correctness, and then, if it's wrong, it can be spat out towards us for us to then check. And this is where, this is what really, if there was one statement which really, really fires me up, it's this one. Because we're a comparatively small data set, we're going to be able to use this to retrospectively check the current NBN data set. Many other recording schemes couldn't dream of doing this, I think, so the size of their data. But hopefully, we'll be able to ensure that the NBN maps will be the standard reference point. This is what keeps you going, night after night, night or day after day, month after month. My family is estimated I've spent 10 hours a week for the past 5 years doing data editing and data entry and data analysis. And it's the thought that in the end, there will be a map anybody can log on to and have a picture, an accurate picture of what caddis distribution is what keeps you going. We have got new keys. A new key has just come out for adult caddis, and this is really excellent because this is going to encourage new recorders, especially moth trappers. You'll have noted what quite a small, comparatively small proportion of my records are coming from, the statutory agencies, the moth trappers, and I've given them feedback as to the moths they will get at light traps. And I have a dream. I've told you about one dream, and I'll tell you about another one. But it's all looking good. But we've got another but hanging in the air. For Riverfly monitoring, I said it was also looking good, but there were problems. So are there common key challenges? And what is the key challenge? And very definitely, for us in the recording, it's maintaining motivation. That is the key issue. So let's focus on what the sort of demotivators. What makes you want to give up recording, give up as a Riverfly monitor, give up recording caddis? For Riverfly monitors, it's this element. They started sampling their rivers, and somehow they had this picture in their mind that they would, they could improve the situation. But they find that, well, it's still, and it's especially the factor where you have rather, moderately good rivers. They're not improving. They're just sampling the same thing again. Now, some of the issues are intractable. The Avon Allen has 6 sewage works. Now, they're okay, but until they introduce very expensive nutrient stripping, they're never going to have a major impact on water quality improvement. So in everything, nothing is the nothing changes. Some of them have started to look at habitat improvements. In other words, you look at the river before you put in something like this, which is, a riffle or a bit of rapids to try and improve the habitat, and then you look at it afterwards. But we think the main thing is probably to increase the intellectual satisfaction of recording by increasing the number of things you would be able to monitor. The recording scheme contributors, for them, I think it's discouraging for beginners. I mean, the keys, despite new keys, it's still not particularly easy to identify to the species level a number of the caddis. And then there's the old problem, which was mentioned before, about a long time from putting the record in to getting a map dot in the end. Those are some of the identification guides, the simpler guides which we've done. You'll notice how Field Studies Council always features highly in our work. But we're also now moving on to this idea, which is to start focusing recording on individual species. We think this might be a way forward to help move on both Riverfly monitors and also Riverfly recording scheme people. they have to be easy to identify, which assists to make them more interesting. But is this going to work? This is sort of an example of one of the schemes we did pick on. And I might say, because I had a short time to prepare this talk, you'll have gathered it's all death by PowerPoint. So the nice slides like this are from Craig, who was going to give the talk. I was able to use a few of his slides. This is the yellow mayfly, which is a very restricted species. It's very distinctive as an adult, very distinctive as a larva. We've even written a species dossier about this species and how interesting it is. And that's the sort of area of the country it occurs in, limited to the River Wye, but we've just found a recent population on the River Team. So within that area, it seemed to be sensible we could produce something to encourage the anglers in that area and sort of also the immediate area around it to look for the riverfly, to look for that mayfly. So one way we did this was to produce postcards. These would they've got a little bit of information on the back and an image on the front. And in certain circumstances, I think, of restricted distributions, these are probably quite successful. We've also, where things are very rare and where there is conservation interest, we've also been able to write habitat management advice. But it's especially these identification guides. So is it going to be worthwhile, this extra effort to record species? And I mean, do the records have to be genuinely useful for recording them to fire up recorders? It's a question, I think, which does worry us. It worries us a lot, and we're not sure we'll have the answer to it. But I've had some inkling that we're not alone in this as a problem. That's the issue about rarities. The information you get might be good, but if I showed you where the yellow mayfly occurred, there's no point in giving a yellow mayfly card to somebody living probably in other parts of the country, because they're not going to see it. So there's nothing for them in the other parts of the country. But so let's choose common species. Well, let's choose a common species, but on the other hand, is a common species going to be yielding anything useful to you? It's common. We know it's all over the place. So so the data I'm going to give you from finding it is not all that useful, is it? Really, honestly, cross your heart. Is it going to be useful? This is an example, though. Another one. I've showed you the yellow mayfly. This is another one, a caddis, where I think the recording card concept could work very well. It's a BAP species, day flyer, short flight period, very attractive, very restricted to a very peculiar habitat. Believe it or not, there are pools under that grass, and that's where it breeds. Very restricted on things like the Surrey heathland, where a lot of people walk their dogs, and we're hoping we can encourage people when they're walking their dogs in June. If you see that, let us know. So there's where I think a focused effort, getting more people in, people who might not necessarily be involved in recording, into looking for your beast could work. These two species which are also declining, that approach could work. But then let's have a look at one which I'm seriously considering from the caddis point of view, the silver sedge. Very distinctive adult, very distinctive larva. But you can expect this. It's genuinely how you could expect this all over the country. Honestly, hand on heart, I don't think that there is any conservation concern over this particular species. It does very well. There are always holes in the distribution. For example, it's really uncommon on the Isle of Man. I don't know why, but it is. So you might say, well, there's always be holes you might be able to fill in. But I think the way I want to focus this is not to worry too much about the utility of the records, but to look for just the pleasure you've got. You have the pleasure of recognising this in your net full of streamlines. It's got a fascinating way it makes its case, it reinforces its case to stop trout chewing it up. It's got lovely jizz, it sort of trundles around in a trail like that, Lovely beast. It's got an interesting parasite, an attractive adult. I mean, all these things, I think, make it interesting. Well, I think they're interesting. But I do wonder, and this has been touched on, I wonder whether, in fact, you might say, well, okay, so I've said it's not worth recording the silver sedge because it's all over the place, you know. But is all recording going to become obsolete? I mean, if you read that carefully, I think I can predict a large-scale redundancies in the great crested newt industry. But then, what if it becomes 3 species, okay? So you say, oh, well, you see, we used to be able to record that, we knew what it was. But now, of course, when it's 3 species, they're all records, they haven't got any value at all, really. But it's still got this nice jizz, it still looks an attractive animal, you still know it's an aggregate species. So I think we should have a change of emphasis, I do honestly think. I think learning to identify more riverflies is not necessarily so you can become a more valuable recorder. Now, you may disagree. You may think, no, people need this Protestant ethic that, I must have done something useful in the day type of thing. But just simply because it's interesting. So we're going to go for, we certainly need to improve, and we are working on this, things like new identification guides. An unashamed plug for the revamp of the McCann Guide to Freshwater Invertebrate Animals. Many of us were brought up with this little blue book which had all the invertebrate taxa in it. Lovely book. It was our Bible. Went out of print. The FBA is just about to launch it, as they say, just in time for Christmas at only £33 plus P&P. We've already got websites. Is that or via the Riverfly scheme or via the BRC. But the dream that I have is UK moths. That's my model. I want to remove the term moth and put either caddis in it. But essentially, what the UK moths does, what it offers, pictures of the adult, a bit of information about it, and also, very critically, the up-to-date NBN map, which will be up-to-date because it'll be a good map. And that's my dream. And realistically, I think it's within grasp. And I now want to mention the other line, which is really very improving. I mentioned that the Environment Agency principally goes for family-level identification, but it isn't. It's rapidly it's improving. It's increasing its level of species identification to make, in fact, it's a standard practice. Mark Diamond, who's had to leave us, but he tells me this is the emphasis now is to get EA biologists to record at the species level because you are going to, you get more information out. And this is a sort of an idea of it's going to be EA first of all, but hopefully it'll go outside of the EA, and that's essentially the sort of manual that's to identify the problems you might have identifying hydropsyche instabilis. The obvious reasons for, again, I apologise for this, if this seems to be a bit patronising, but imagine within the family Hydropsychidae, that's the cool water species, that's the soupy water species, but if you had pollution which changed from A to B, the BNWP wouldn't detect that at all. And this famous European Water Framework Directive, which in its very, very simplified way makes if your water body is bad, make it better. If it's good, keep it good and keep it unchanged. Well, how can you keep it unchanged unless you do species-level identification? So this is a very exciting concept. I believe the EA is now sharing data very frequently. I think you said monthly with the NBN. And with all of this good species-level data coming in, when we add that up, the maps which we have for the NBN are going to become increasingly good. Environment Agency data that I got, it used to be really exciting. You would look at it and it was full of unbelievable species, but it was an exciting read. Now, it's boringly believable. But having said that, they do know. They now, any rare species is fed through CEH or fed through myself. So as I say, it's all good news in that respect. So finally, do I think our records are fit for purpose? Are the records of riverflies which are being assembled, are they fit for purpose? Well, I think they can be used, we'll say in the general terms, for conservation. Certainly they can be used for conservation. But I think, essentially, it's increasing the enjoyment of recording riverflies is what I'm looking for. But there was one thing we do have to tackle and overcome. And I'll switch to blue butterflies in this respect. And I spoke to the manager of a record centre known to Tom, and he said to me, look, what value is, somebody says they've found a blue butterfly on the site, what value is that? Well, you could say, well, at least there are an awful lot of sites where you don't get a blue butterfly on, but in general terms, what value is that? Well, what I think he really meant was that if all I have is a record, if my database is just full of records of blue butterflies, I'm going to have problems selling that data to an environmental consultant. But if you then use that blue, you've got to grab the person who's got that blue butterfly record and then possibly get him to record to the next level. But above all, I think really, and this certainly applies to the Riverfly scheme as well, we need to be able to prove a genuine value in records which are at this more basic level of identification and enjoyment. And we'll have a lot more records coming in. But the big part of this, I think, which I really want to sell, is that recording freshwater life is always enjoyable. It's always fun to be recording freshwater. And I offer that to anybody who's writing promotional literature. They can have that free for nothing.
Thank you, that was great fun. We have a little bit of time for questions, if anyone has one. No. Thank you very much. Good. I'll just finish up by saying a few words. I think all the talks we've had today are to be congratulated in how well they've addressed the theme that we had for the conference today. That question mark at the end of fit for purpose is clearly important. There's a lot that we can congratulate ourselves on, but it's clear that the challenges rather outweigh that. The NBN, as was mentioned in one or two of the talks, now has just over 80 million species records. I suspect that probably in a year's time that will be 100 million or so. We may even be able to present that 100 millionth certificate at the conference next year. That would be rather nice. But having 100 million species records in itself and being the UK's repository for wildlife biodiversity data, that is great in itself, but it doesn't really mean all that much. The key to how the NBN will function over the next few years all revolves around the word usage. How will we use that data? And that is going to pose great challenges to us all, because there isn't just a single usage. There are research scientists that have particular demands on biodiversity data. They're conservationists, they're local record people, there are policymakers, there are national groups, and they all require somewhat different things of a vast database like the Gateway. And so we have to develop that gateway to accommodate that, and I see that as a major challenge for the period in which I will be chairman, and hopefully in a few years' time we'll look back on this period as one of the most exciting, challenging times for the NBN. I'd like to finish with just a couple of things. First, can we all congratulate all the speakers that have done such an excellent job today? And secondly, thank you all for coming and have a safe journey home. Thank you.